Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. Can you believe I'm doing this so early? I had to rearrange my schedule and I wanted to take advantage of the fact that I was ready to go. So I'm gonna start our weekend book and see how long I can go before it's coffee break time. Okay, so this week I'm doing a really interesting, really fun book by an author we've already covered. If you recall, a month ago, we did The Truth About Lies with Aja RADEN. Great book, all about the cons, the shell game, the big lie, not that big lie, although yes, that big lie. All the different con stuff that can get pulled on people, lots of good psychological insight, history as well. And so I read her other book, Stoned. And I have to tell you, I loved this book. It was the perfect combination of history and a little bit of psychology and some interesting facts about gems, and I just loved this book, and I hope you guys will too. So let's just jump right into it, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Now, Aja, as we learned when we did this first book of hers, The Truth About Lies, but I'll refresh your memory. She studied ancient history and physics at the University of Chicago. She worked for the House of Con auction house. She has designed jewelry. She does all sorts of really interesting things. And I'm working assiduously at arranging a conversation with her, probably tomorrow. Fingers crossed, we'll see. Things have been happening, but we will just move forward with the book and hope for the best here. So as far as an interview with her. So the name of the book is Stoned. It was written in 2015. And as you'll find from this book, the emerald is probably one of the more rare and more precious gems in the world. Remember the big lie about diamonds, which totally cracked me up. There's nothing I hate worse on YouTube than those ridiculous proposal videos, and I don't know why they bother me so much. I guess I'm not a romantic. I'm sentimental, but I'm not a romantic. I watched The Bachelor. You know, too many of those relationships fall apart within the first couple of months. By the way, the last Bachelorette broken up. They were engaged. So let's move forward with Stoned. So she starts with a quote: "The history of the world is the history of desire." And we are physically motivated by the sight of a beautiful object. I thought this was so interesting. If you look at something that appeals to you for its beauty, this will trigger the motor cerebellum in the area of your body, of your brain, governing hand movement. And you will be instinctively triggered to reach out. Isn't that fascinating? You see something that you like and your brain tells you to reach for it. Totally instinctive, totally a neurological drive. It's a response that was probably useful in evolution, and we still have it. So when they say that beauty moves us, it literally moves us. The book is really well structured, and I really like this about Aja's writing. You can see the science in her mind because she has a very organized, intelligent approach to any topic, which makes it very easy to follow her line of thinking. And she says that history, the history of jewelry especially, is governed by three verbs: to have, well, let me do them in the right order: to want, to take, and to have. Jewelry has been the currency of history, and we're going to go into that, a very fascinating history. It is symbolic. It has emotional significance. It represents wealth and power. And for some people, it speaks of safety and home. Economic scarcity and demand govern the movement of jewelry throughout history. So this book looks at history through the lens of desire, through the way that it motivates the human brain and therefore human activity. Jewelry spawned cultural movements, it launched political dynasties, and it has really started conflicts and wars, which we'll get into. Very interesting story. So this book has three parts. The part about want, which is the nature and the nature of value and desire. It looks at the other part, number 2, to take, which talks about the corrosive human tendency to covet. Now, isn't that one of the deadly sins, or one of the cardinal sins, or a commandment or something? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. I don't think you're supposed to covet your neighbor's goods, so I guess jewelry would count. And then the third part is to have, which is constructive. It's about the consequences of our love of things and how creation and construction historically manifested in relationship to jewelry and gems. So this is about desire and its ability to change the world. So part 1, to want, desire, delusion, and the scarcity effect. And I do believe we talked about that before in The Truth About Lies. Value does not necessarily equal the size of something, the beauty of something, or the quality of it. Value equals perceived rarity or perceived scarcity. So the less there is of something, the more valuable it becomes, no matter how ratchet it is. Real imagined value is all about perception. It's all about the brain. For example, fat women were considered extraordinarily beautiful in the 1800s because there was a shortage of food. Most people suffered food scarcity, and therefore if you had the luxury of being overweight, we would call it overweight, they didn't look at it as overweight, they looked at it as somebody who was wealthy. And these women were scarce. There weren't many of them. They were rare, and they were considered beautiful. Voluptuousness was a sign of beauty. So, talk about being born in the wrong place and time. Chapter 1, keep the change. The beads that bought Manhattan. And we're talking about 1626. This is one of those apocryphal stories that, as Americans, we're all very familiar. Let's see if I can find this quotation. There's some choice quotes in this book. When asked by an anthropologist what the Indians called America before the white man came, an Indian, Native American, said simply, ours. And of course the proverb, one man's trash is another man's treasure. So, the age of exploration could have been called the age of exploitation. It was the race to own the world by people in Western Europe. The Portuguese did it by brute force. The Spanish did it by declaring that they were God's chosen people and God wanted them to own the world. And the British didn't need a justification. They didn't justify themselves to anybody. The Dutch were the merchants. They shopped for countries. They were smart. They watched what everybody else was doing, coercion, fighting, stealing. And they thought, well, no, this could be negotiated. And they did it in a business-like way. In 1626, a Dutchman by the name of Peter Minuit bought Manhattan from the Lenape of the Delaware Nation for $24 worth of glass beads and trinkets. Both sides of this deal were very happy with the results. And we tend, not me personally, but certainly it was presented to me this way as a child in school, and I think unwoke American history has tended to tell this story dismissive about the way that the white men got one over on the Native Americans. That's really not what happened. May 4th, 1626, this guy from the Dutch East India Company, who had been under orders to treat the natives fairly, did a sale with them. And what they negotiated was a contract that the Dutch could live on the island, use the island. They didn't, I don't think, really understand that the Dutch thought that they now owned the island. Kind of a different thing. So that they thought that they were renting the space or leasing it or whatever. So because they were not aware of the white people's motivation or understanding or expectation, they were really happy with the sale. As far as they were concerned, gemstones, which are just colorful gravel, jewels, they're valued for their scarcity. And for example, in Myanmar, rubies are junk. They have so many rubies. The only reason that they have value is because they're valued on the international market. To the Lenape, glass beads were a wonder and were rare and were very valuable. So an example that Asia points out is tulip mania in the 1630s. Tulips were grown in Turkey. The Dutch managed to get their hands on a few bulbs in 1559, and slowly the popularity grew, but it exploded for some reason in 1637, and from February to May, the tulip mania was unbelievable. It was the first economic bubble in recorded history. By 1630, all the wealthy people had tulip collections. They were the thing to own. Everybody had a tulip garden. If you wanted to look wealthy, you had to have a tulip garden. And you were socially shunned if you didn't have a tulip garden. Prices skyrocketed. One bulb became the equivalent of a modest house at the time. One tulip bulb was worth the value of a house. In the frenzy, the lower and the middle classes began selling their homes to buy a tulip bulb. You know, we laugh now. May I remind you of 2008. There was one called Semper Augustus, which was a red and white, and it sold, the price of it, for the value of 12, I couldn't read the number, 12 acres of land for one tulip bulb. But then the Black Death broke out in Harlem, and it broke out at exactly the same time that a big auction was scheduled, and it was a by invitation only auction of wealthy people coming to get these Semper Augustus valuable tulip bulbs. And people heard about Black Death and stayed home. They didn't go to the auction. So the tulip auction was a bust, and it started a panic. There became doubt about the desirability of tulips. The tulip stock market crashed. People stopped their buying. They defaulted on their contracts. Investors went broke. People became homeless because of this. The Hague, the seat of government in the Netherlands, declared tulip sales to be gambling debts and wouldn't bail anybody out. And smarter than the American government that bailed out all those banks, but that's my personal opinion for entertainment purposes only. So in 2 months, half of Holland became destitute. In 2 months, they were literally destitute. And this spread. Tulips were worth nothing, and that's called the scarcity effect. Everyone has to have it. It becomes a rage. Pretty soon everybody has it, and you know, it loses its luster. Remember Beanie Babies? Remember Cabbage Patch Dolls? Oh my God. Value works like an economic syllogism. Everyone has to have it because everyone has to have it. The more other people want it, the more you'll pay to have it. And the more you'll pay to have it, the more convinced other people become that it must be valuable, and therefore the more they in turn will pay for the same thing. This is the absurd and imaginary way in which the value of rare and coveted things just explodes. An interesting quirk of the scarcity effect is that it doesn't require actual scarcity. The fact that one failed auction was the dart that popped the tulip bubble isn't as surprising as it sounds. The value of those coveted bulbs, like the value of diamonds and gems, was not only based on beauty or exoticism, nor was their record-breaking value determined entirely by dearth. It was determined by other people's competitive desire to possess the same item. When it comes to a limited good, the mere perception of scarcity is adequate to send your brain into a tailspin. So we're talking again about neurology. So you should have your head examined is the name of this part of the book. Study with cookies. They did a study with cookies, red and blue cookies, presenting people with plates of red and blue cookies. And what they were able to determine was that if you see something is popular with other people, you want it more. So they put these cookies out, and some people picked red and some people picked blue, and I guess there were a couple of plants encouraged to pick only one color. Pretty soon everybody was going for that color because there must be something special about it. And the worst case is that, not that you can't have it, but that somebody else can have it. So it's bad that you can't have something popular, but it's worse if you realize that other people around you do have it. And perceived scarcity, it hinders the ability to think. It suppresses the cognitive processes. So you actually become stupid. The more you want something because you think other people have it and you don't, the stupider you get. Remarkable. Desire, especially for a limited good, makes us act without thinking. This makes those around us want it, so then we want it more, and it becomes a feedback loop. Desire makes you stupid. Scarce, you have to have it. It's a biological compulsion. We don't even realize that we're being driven by something completely out of our control. So back to Manhattan. That was an aside. The name Manhattan means the place where we all get drunk. And the early Dutch and the early the natives at the time used to get together and get drunk there, I guess, and that's why it became called Manhattan. It's 23 square miles, and there's not much there. It's a soft bay around it, which is shored up literally by trash, 15% landfill. No one really much wanted it. There were some oysters, but not a lot, and that was it. Nothing on it, actually. So it was completely unfarmable because it's got a granite base. And actually, interesting little aside, the fact that it had this granite foundation to the island is what lent itself to the building of skyscrapers, which is why New York City had so many skyscrapers, because of the support of the granite. You can see this granite in Central Park. There are rock formations scattered around the park. Those are all part of the underneath granite. Some facts about Manhattan Island. The weather's horrible. It's surrounded by a very choppy body of water. It is almost completely devoid of natural resources. And today, the real estate on Manhattan is some of the most expensive, most desirable real estate on the planet. Why? Scarcity. It's like a jewel. So, the spice race. Why were the Dutch interested in Manhattan? They were in the market for spices from the Far East, and they needed a pit stop. And spices were not just for curry, they were used medicinally and recreationally as drugs. Spices have drug-like qualities, and they can be very dangerous and difficult to get, especially in those days. Some spices are rare and hard to find. The spice trade was a convoluted sort of trip. The Europeans went to Constantinople. Then they took the Silk Road across Asia to China. It was long, it was arduous, it was time consuming, it was dangerous. In 1453, the Ottoman leader Mehmed II took Constantinople and blocked European access. So they needed to find a different trade route. So this is a little bit about the back and forth movement of Europeans at the time. In 1492, of course, Columbus took his stupid route to Asia and ended up discovering something he didn't realize he discovered. In 1497, Vasco da Gama found the Cape of Good Hope, and because he went the other way, and he was back in 2 years with great wealth, and so he was considered much more of a success than Columbus. In 1520, Magellan began his circumnavigation of the globe, and in the years between 1568 and 1648, the Dutch were in the process of trying to throw off Spanish rule so that they could join the spice race. In 1558, the English were poor, second-rate country with a weak Queen Elizabeth I. Didn't get a lot of respect when she first started out because why? Well, she was a woman, and certainly Western Europeans did not believe a woman had the right to be on a throne, and all male leaders thought were dismissive of her as a woman. She decided to begin a campaign of piracy against Spain. Spain had a formidable navy, and she sent out pirateers. We'll talk about them in a minute, but they were essentially contracted soldiers of fortune on boats. They were paid to go out and commit acts of piracy, maraud against the ships of other countries, and they stole a lot of the New World plunder from the Spanish, and eventually they defeated the Spanish Armada. We'll certainly get to that. The English and the Dutch were good at colonization. They fought each other over business in the New World. We had the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. They wanted land to colonize. Henry Hudson he was English, but he worked for the Dutch. He was the one who kind of found New York, although, New York wasn't exactly lost, but he was trying to get to the east. That's not really east. That would be east. The Dutch would call dibs on an area and get right of first claim, not really ownership. They sort of got dibs on using the area, which is why they did that deal with Manhattan. And they formalized this deal about Manhattan with glass beads. And why would they pay? Well, they were ordered by the church to treat the natives fairly, which is really ironic. The New World was a free-for-all, and the Catholic Church was behind this free-for-all. A papal bull by Alexander VI, this is a pope, and a bull is like a executive order by the pope, called Inter Caetera, amongst all, ratified the Treaty of Tordesillas. It divided the globe into territories between Spain and Portugal, which was great for the Pope and Spain and Portugal, but not so much the rest of the world. However, the motto of the Dutch East Indies was basically, Christ is good, but trade is better. So they took this division of the New World by the Pope and Spain and Portugal as sort of an interesting fact to tuck away, but they were going to go do business. They didn't care about the Pope's threat of excommunication because they weren't Catholic, so it's hard to get kicked out of something you don't belong to. They negotiated with what they called the Wilden, that's what they called the natives, and they paid. And they paid for the land with contracts, like a business venture. And it was a clever attempt to neutralize the church's claim. They believed that if they were fair, what could the church say? I have an obvious business contract here. Make something of it. The Venetians in Italy traded, well, it wasn't Italy yet, traded beads with Africa and Indonesia. The Venetians are famous for their glass, and glass was a rarity in those days, really rare outside Europe. It was very valuable in the 16th and 17th century, and glass was actually regarded in the same way that currency is regarded today. In the Renaissance era, there were no traveler's checks. Glass was light and portable. Glass beads were light and portable, a good way to bring something of value to trade. Beads and buttons were luxury items. Before that, people tied things together, and suddenly now they had beads and buttons, a new adventure, a new invention. And it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that they glutted the market. Before that, they were handmade. They were a rarity. So if you look at jewelry right now, and this actually does tie in. If you look at jewelry today and you look at a silver ring, not these rings, you look at a silver ring, you'll see a mark in it, and the metal mark in gold or silver tells you the percentage of gold or silver, and it's a federal crime to change that mark, and it's a federal crime to make jewelry and not include that mark, and it's a federal crime to remove that mark, because technically gold and silver all belong to the Federal Reserve, because jewelry is money. Isn't that interesting? So you'll see a 925, and that means there's 92.5% silver. They mix it with an alloy for durability, I believe, or malleability. We'll have to ask Aja. But that's sterling silver. It means it's authentic, and it has to be there. If it's not there, then, you know, your ring is going to turn your finger green. So it can be melted down, silver or gold, and used as currency, used as money, and therefore all jewelry has to be marked properly. Now here's a little thing I didn't know. I thought this was so interesting. So we all love Broadway, right? I mean, you know, I have a bird who's heavily into Broadway show tunes. And in fact, she's listening to the movie soundtrack of Chicago. She prefers the jazz band in that particular rendition. Broadway, what's its nickname? The Great White Way. And, you know, we all assumed, I know I did, that that was because of all the lights. I've been to Broadway, not on Broadway. I've walked down Broadway. And it's really lit up with all the neon lights in the theaters. It's very exciting. So why is it really called the Great White Way? It's because of oyster shells. Manhattan and Staten Island were called, Manhattan was Little Oyster Island and Staten Island was Big Oyster Island. They had, like I said, oyster beds around them. And there was a footpath that ran along a brook for the full length along this brook that had oysters. And on the footpath were crushed oyster shells. And the natives would collect these shells to make wampum. Wampum is a Narragansett word. It means white shell beads. And the white part was made by the North American whelk shell, and the violet part was made by quahog, hard shell clams. And they would construct beads out of these shells and put them into belts, big long strips of beads, really beautiful. It was called wampum, and it was used as an exchange item, money between the Native Americans from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Great Plains. The Sioux traded the same way. They made tubes out of the shell, and they were woven into rows on the beads, and they had a standardized value, and they were the diamonds of North America at the time. All cultures have done this. They use jewels for religious purposes, and they use them for practical transactional purposes. But Broadway is the Great White Way because it had oyster shells all along it originally, and the name stuck. And of course, we also used jewels for adornment, goes without saying. The Iroquois used white whelks, their shell, the same way that modern Europeans use diamonds. It was considered wealth. The Iroquois used purple shells, the quahog, the same way that some modern Europeans use blue sapphires. It's a spiritual symbol. In the Middle East, sapphires have no spiritual value. Emeralds do. Green is the color of resurrection in the Middle East. It means life after death. And it represents other religious things. So you'll notice that many Middle Eastern flags are green or incorporate green, and you'll see people wearing green sashes and green is a spiritual symbol in the Middle East. The currency of the Middle East was pearls. Bahrain was the pearl center for 1,000 years. I'm wearing my pearls in honor of this book today. Here's something that I didn't know. I'm very embarrassed to admit I didn't know this, and I'm horrified by the way that I was taught in school, because what I knew was what I was taught. I grew up in Southern California, and in California, the teaching of California history is mandatory in the 4th grade, and you spend a whole year. You learn about the California missions, Father Junipero Serra, you learn a little tiny bit about John Muir, and you learn about the gold rush, Sutter's Mill. And in Santa Barbara, where I grew up, the Native Americans that lived there before the Spanish came were the Chumash Indians. Now, this is what I was taught about the Chumash Indians. And if you are of Chumash descent, please don't be offended, because I want to do a comparison, and you need something with which to compare. So I have to tell the bad part. We were taught that when the Spanish came, the Chumash Indians were lying around doing nothing in the Santa Barbara has this gorgeous climate. I mean, it's just, it really is the Garden of Eden, and everything grows there. I think at one time when I was a child, we had close to 30 different varieties of fruit trees growing in our backyard, and we were not special. This was typical. And abundance of seafood, and there was wild game, and it was just, food was easily available. The weather was beautiful 11 and a half months of the year. They had access to fresh water in the hills. This is life. This was the way to live. And we were taught that they built nothing, did nothing, and had no culture because they were lazy. And when the Spanish came, they brought them religion, and they brought them basic hygiene, and they brought them how to build structures. Well, the reality that we find out now, the Santa Barbara mission was built by the Chumash Indians under the supervision of the Spanish, and there's a beautiful fountain in front of the church. And what we now know is this fountain was used as like a washing area for clothes, and that the Native American women were doing slave labor all day long, washing clothes, and that they were enslaved and mistreated, and it was the worst form of human bondage. And they were, of course, as always happens, minimized in the eyes of the Spaniards so that they could justify mistreating them and not feel guilty about it, because they were bringing them Jesus. I got married in the Santa Barbara mission. That took some string pulling, let me tell you, and really had no decorations, because it is absolutely gorgeous inside. It has the original walls, or all frescoes done by hand by the Chumash Indians. It is beautiful. If you can go online and look at the interior of that church, it's really, really gorgeous. But I digress. So here's something I didn't know about the Chumash Indians before the Spaniards came, because we didn't know anything correct about them. They had an elaborate banking system. They used this stuff called olivella shells that were carved into discs or beads. And I've seen them. I've seen their traditional clothing has these on them. I didn't know that's what I was looking at. And they were called oncom, like wampum. And they were used as both jewelry and for religious purposes and for trade. Elaborate banking system. And the green and violet ones had religious significance. The Chumash banking system was very intricate. They had a regional system of government that was representative. They had land ownership. They even included in their system of ownership land use rights with rentals, so that you could use the land and pay to use the resources on it, like pay to use the avocado trees, pay to use the peach trees, and not actually have property rights on it. So they're Spanish of 1400s. It's a shame. It's I laugh because otherwise we'd cry, and it's too early in the morning. So the Iroquois had wampum as well. So money is the same historically and globally. The idea of it, just what the actual currency itself is, differs based on valuable perception, based on scarcity. The natives in Manhattan, the Lenape, used wampum like the Dutch used the beads made in Holland, which interestingly enough were referred to as slave beads because they traded with the people in Africa and often bought people from Africa with them. The Banda Islands is an archipelago of volcanic islands in the South Pacific, which are the Spice Islands, and those are the only place that nutmeg grew at the time. In 1599, the Dutch had driven the Portuguese out of these islands, and because nutmeg only grows on the volcanic soil of Banda Island, the Dutch dipped the nutmeg into calcium oxide lime to sterilize the kernels so that they wouldn't grow anywhere else. And nutmeg is a powerful hallucinogen. And you read to be careful when you measure nutmeg for cooking, to not overdo it. There are medicinal reasons why it's dangerous. It, at the time, was an exotic and very difficult to get drug. And the area where it was grown was first owned by the British, owned by the Portuguese, and they had a truce to not attack this island because they didn't want anything bad to happen to the nutmeg. So the Dutch went ahead and just burned it to the ground. And in 1666, they bought this island. This is one of those Banda archipelago called Run. They bought it in trade for New Amsterdam, which is New York. So New York basically changed hands from the Dutch to the English because of nutmeg in the South Pacific. They wanted to use this particular area as a base to attack the Spanish. The English did. They tried to exchange it again for a sugar island in South America. And once they realized, there's nothing here, they tried to renegotiate. And the Dutch said, no, sorry, we need the sugar island. So the British, they were stuck with New York. Nutmeg took hold in Grenada and ended the monopoly of the Spice Islands on nutmeg, and nutmeg lost its huge amount of rarity and value. So the Lenape in Manhattan traded the island for glass beads. The Dutch took the island and traded it to the English for nutmeg, and then had second thoughts and That's the way history's cookie crumbles. So that's the end of that chapter. And I'm going to stop and upload this, and I'll be back in a little while. And in the meantime, sláinte and slán go fóill.